Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today I get to talk with a couple of heroes of mine. These are peace researchers in California. And one of them is Marc Pilisuk, who had been a professor of peace and conflict studies at Berkeley, my alma mater. And since he's been retired, he's teaching at Saybrook University.
Good to be here.
Great to see you, Marc. And in Sonoma, or at least near Sonoma State University, where he retired officially about 3 days ago, we have Peter Phillips.
Oh, thank you very much, Metta.
Okay, I want to start off with Marc Pilisuk because we just had a little chat in which we sort of touched base about our common friendship with Anatole Rappaport, who was famous for his work on game theory. I want to ask Marc to tell me a little bit about the work that you did with Anatole and what you made of it.
When I worked with Anatole Rappaport, he guided me through his really brilliant work on the prisoner's dilemma, which was a characteristic of situations in which if both sides do what is optimal for themselves, they both wind up losing. And if both sides do a conciliatory move, they both wind up winning. However, if one side does the conciliatory move and the other one does the negative move, the one who does the negative move wins doubly at the expense of the other one. There's a tendency for them to develop distrust for the other one once they've been stabbed in the back, and they wind up in a deadlock of distrust. Mm-hmm. They both wind up with negative consequences where they could have had a more positive consequence all the way along. But anyway, what was interesting with that is Anatole and I worked out a situation in this experimental research where people had a chance to communicate whether they were going to cooperate or to defect on a gradual basis. There's a degree of cooperation or a degree of defection that they could do. And they also had a chance to announce before their final decision what they were going to do. And then they had a chance to either break the trust or not break the trust with that. And what we found out was that through a set of unilateral moves, you could take a very recalcitrant, negatively oriented person who was already deadlocked into a situation of distrust, and with a certain set of unilateral moves, you could actually induce them to move into a cooperative situation. Well, that seemed like a brilliant thing. Well, why not use it to end the Cold War? Mm-hmm. We could give some moves unilaterally and announce them in advance and match them one for another. And at this point, I realized that there were limits to this. That it wasn't the knowledge of what moves should be taken that prevented us from ending the Cold War or from ending the large-scale amount of military violence that we have all over the world. But it was because there were a group of people, group of institutions who did not have that outcome at all. That the information on how to resolve the problem would just be a way to enforce them to find ways to use that information and not resolve the problem. They had a stake in it. And so what I
So in other words, they did not want to have the problem really solved.
That they did not want to. They lived in a world in which the people that they knew did not want to. Mm-hmm. They lived in a world in which they needed a perpetual enemy. Mm-hmm. They lived in a world where their status and their financial compensation was dependent upon the continuation of this elite power structure, which sometimes and frequently needed war. This led me to look at who those people were, what the institutions were, and how they operated to prevent the movement toward peace. A huge and intricate army of workers working secretly perpetuate their objectives and goals. And one of the most important works on that is the one that Peter Phillips has written about in a book recently called Giants. He really goes into this with extreme detail of who these people are, what corporations they represent, how these corporations are interlocked one to another. And I think that that's, in some ways, that's not an ending point, that's a starting point for understanding, well, what are the options that we can have.
It's a documented list of enormous importance. I bet you have phone numbers of all of the most important people in the world that you could call after all the research you've done on these folks, right? Tell us a bit about your book.
It's the Global Power Elite. Was a couple, 3 years in development. And what we did was we looked at capitalism and what the most important part of that was, and that's, of course, money, and how concentrated that was in the world today, and increasingly more concentrated. So there are investment management companies that manage rich people's money. Some of the largest of those are BlackRock, Chase Manhattan Bank, and Deutsche Bank, and they will manage trillions of dollars of wealth. So there's 17 companies, that was as of 2017. There's 17 companies that control $41 trillion worth of capital.
How much capital would you say there is in the world?
Well, there's the wealth is right in the $250 trillion range. But a lot of that wealth is tied up in land holdings and buildings, and it's things that are worth things, but it's not cash. So this is a major part of the cash in the world. And it's very, very concentrated. There are 17 companies that have over $1 trillion, and they controlled 41 trillion collectively. And there's only 200 people that are the directors, the boards of directors of those companies. So we have less than a few hundred people, of which we identify in the book who they are.
Not only do you identify, but you tell all kinds of personal things about them: who married whom, when, and how many kids they have, and where they have houses, and what their hobbies are. And it's quite a remarkable thing. I don't know how you got this kind of information.
But most of the information was public, and if you go to the stock holdings in a corporation's annual report, they will list their primary stockholders, but they also list the stock holdings of their boards of directors. So that's one place to find out the public wealth of these individuals. So they're all worth millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And they have a shared interest of having capital grow and expand. And in doing so, they all invest in each other. So all 17 of these giant investment companies are interconnected by co-investments. Like, 40 billion was they cross-invested with each other. So it's a huge amount of money, very highly concentrated. And their biggest problem is they don't have enough places to invest and get a good return. So, the Silicon Valley investors are all heavily invested in Silicon Valley and electronics and computers and everything else, but then they're invested in war-making companies, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman. They're highly, invested in the food industry, a variety of different things where they can get a good return. But they're so wealthy, there's so much wealth concentrated there that there aren't enough good places in the world to invest. So they're stuck investing in speculative kinds of investments. The subprime mortgage investments was one of the issues in 2008 that they had invested in that wasn't stable, it wasn't adequate. And
And they knew it at the time.
they did know it.
They
They did
knew
know it, and they were betting against it. Yes. And they're kind of in the same situation now. They've redone the mortgage investment packages, and they're in a situation where there's 50 trillion that these small number of people are controlling today, and there isn't enough places to do it. So governments try to help them be stable and maintain. One of the ways that governments do that, of course, is give them money to stabilize them, but also give them huge contracts in terms of investment in war. War is one of the stronger profit-making issues in the world. So continuation of war and permanent war is one aspect of centralized capital and capitalism the way it is evolved today.
To
It's a
what
very
extent
small
are
number.
they mindful of that? You know, some of these guys, you even mentioned names of people who were, I mean, they speak a good language, speak good rhetoric about being peaceful or wanting to overcome poverty. They're left liberals, I would say. I don't know what proportion of them are, but they're the kind of people that I wouldn't mind, you know, having dinner with. You know, they sound like nice folks compared to Trump people. And I just wonder, are they aware that their interest is tied up with militarism, and that they are part of the problem by just the fact that they're in a situation where they need to invest in military equipment?
Go ahead, Mark.
When you look at them as individual persons, you miss something. These persons are deeply interconnected with each other and with certain groups that make major decisions about the allocation of money for almost anything, for almost any good cause or any bad cause. You'll find their names on the boards of things like the World Bank.
Mm-hmm.
You find them on international trade associations. You'll find many of them whose work goes on a daily basis with decisions that just happen to benefit the global elite. As individuals, many of them support positive foundations. The same companies which drain out destroy the land in sub-Saharan Africa and throughout the world and take it away from what used to be viable farming communities and cause those communities to be struggling for survival. The same people are have foundations that are giving aid to provide assistance to get food to these countries.
Our conversation began sort of by saying there are some people who are so locked into a destructive, competitive, dog-eat-dog, one side wins only by having the other side lose kind of mentality. This is when we were talking about game theory and Prisoner's Dilemma, that they can't seem to break out of that way of thinking and even see the possibility, when it's right in front of them, of benefiting by cooperation. And that happens to be an issue that is very much on my mind. I lie awake nights thinking the world is so full of, frankly, stupid people that I'm going to be interviewing a guy in a day or two who has a book called something like Too Dumb for Democracy. You know, they're talking about the extent to which people act in contrary to their own interests. They can't even see when they're doing things that are harmful to themselves. And politically, that seems to be what's going on in the world today, because democracies are everywhere in trouble, because large proportions of the population are electing people and making choices that are contrary to anything that they could possibly benefit from. So the title of your book, the subtitle is what interests me. It's something like, who benefits from war and violence? Is that the subtitle?
Violence.
Yeah. I mean, do people know that they are benefiting from violence and war always, or are they doing it just sort of like they can't think of any other thing to do?
They don't conceive of the idea that that system can change. Within the failings of that system, they see problems that are not working, and they see the best ways that they can patch them over. And one of the ways that they can do this is to perpetuate through the media, which they have a tremendous control, to perpetuate the idea that solutions are based upon individuals doing something creative and helping themselves get along, and not on doing something that will change the decision making of who is in charge of all of those resources that they sit on.
Mm-hmm.
That's their power. And it's easy for them to be convinced by their friends that those are the best things that they could be doing, and that the other things are unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm. Peter, in your research, did you actually get to know any of these folks?
A lot of these people are high-level corporate CEOs on the boards of directors. They're not very reachable. You mentioned, I don't have their home phones. I can only reach them through their corporations, and usually end up with some sort of PR person who responds to you. Part of this is what's called the transnational capitalist class. This is the elites, wealth managers in the world who are protecting global capital, absolutely believe that they're doing the best thing for the world by continuing growth. Capital has to continue to grow in order to get a return. So they're locked into that system. Now some certainly realize that there's environmental concerns and there's concerns with war, but none of those supersede the whole idea of capital growth and continued expansion of the system. They really believe that by continuing to grow capital, it'll trickle down and save the world. That's absolutely not true. You've got 30,000+ people a day dying from starvation in the world with more than enough food to feed everybody. It's just not distributed. A lot of food is destroyed. A third of the food in the world is thrown away because they can't sell it. It's all based upon profit and return. Where we have more than adequate resources to take care of everybody in the world, those resources aren't being properly managed or used. They're putting money into things like 1.3 billion Coca-Cola bottles.
I want to be the devil's advocate here because I have disputes with friends of mine about whether or not we can have a no-growth economy, whether we can deliberately set out to say we're not looking for any growth. And I say, well, look, if you want to do away with capitalism, okay, that's how you would do it. That would be the effect. I don't know what else you've got. I've been to too many communist societies when it was still in a very active state of affairs, and to ever want to live in a communist society. What else is there? You got capitalism or what? And capitalism, I quite agree. All the bad things that you're saying are true, and the logic of what they're saying seems to me, what you're reporting accurately. They are in a situation where it has to grow, because let's say the notion of capitalism is you borrow money, which is capital, to invest in an enterprise of some kind, with the idea that at the end of the year, you're going to make so much more money that you can pay off the loan, the interest on whatever you've borrowed, and still have some profit and continue to grow. And if you haven't grown some during that year, you're not going to be able to pay off the loan on your capital. So clearly it's built in that you have to have capital growth. I don't know how to get around that. What's your answer? What do we do instead of capitalism if that if I'm correct in, and if these guys are correct in saying they have to have growth, or there's going to be a tragic situation. I think there's going to be a tragic situation this year because of the pandemic, which means that there is going to be a real depression, and that's not something I look forward to. So I'm not saying that capitalism is something I celebrate, but I'm saying I don't know what else there is. Tell me what your solution is.
I don't have an exact solution. People ask me, well, what do you do to fix it? I think we have to address the problems in the world and realistically look at solving them. The environmental issues, the pandemic issues, the war and expansion of war are all critical things that can destroy humanity. So if these elites want to have their grandchildren still be around and have a viable world to live in, they're going to have to make some adjustments, and we have to help them along. That's what's so important about activism, and continuing to say wealth cannot be concentrated just among a few individuals.
The other question I think one might raise is really inevitable that the only way to get the kind of money payback, the interest and profit that is required to keep capitalism going would be through militarism or through things like fossil fuels and so on. Why, in other words, why is it we continue to have these very deleterious investments when we could, in fact, probably, I think, you could pretty much make an argument that you might make more money by investing in alternative sources of energy and things of that kind. So I mean, just because I say that I don't see how to do without capitalism doesn't mean that I'm saying that capitalism has to be in the form that it exists now, which was the extraordinary levels of inequality that you're talking about and the linkage to militarism.
Their centralizing process of global capital threatens the entire stability of the world. I mean, they were to a point before the pandemic where they had $1.4 quadrillion invested in derivatives, betting on each other's stock holdings. They're not investing in new capital growth and building new factories or making more food. They're investing in capital as it exists and trying to make money off of it. There's an entire, in the last 30 years, it's all been about the investment financialization of people with wealth investing in each other. No new creative activities, unless, some companies are still doing that. But the majority of the wealth is being wasted in terms of investments with a demand for a return. That's the critical issue here, is that all that capital continues to demand and seek a return, whereby we could choose to use those resources and that capital to feed everybody in the world, to reverse the environmental destruction, to suspend war. Literally, there's more than adequate resources to do that. Those are political decisions. Those are democratic political decisions that people, if we really had a democratic process, would choose to do. Wealth is concentrated. Very little, it doesn't trickle down. It continues to be more concentrated. And elites know that. They know that this is a problem, and we're trying to tell them that they better fix this or their grandkids aren't going to be around.
Any number of bright people can sit down and concoct what they think would be an ideal society with everybody well-fed and everybody having some opportunity to live a decent life and resources protected so that the environment would be sustainable. We can do that on paper. But the question is, what can we do in the situation that we have now? And a lot of it has to do with this question of who is the we. Mm-hmm. That if we rely upon governments at this time, governments are largely bought by this elite class. They have an open door. They go in and out of governmental positions. They go in and out of the positions of the agencies, which decide how much money is going to go to support them. So what is it that those of us who don't have the same access to political decision-making can do. And in my mind, there's something that remains hopeful, that we see that despite the despair that comes from fighting against really difficult causes, that people are extremely innovative in how they organize on particular projects. Some of them, for example, work on models in which a corporate entity deciding to withdraw from a community are given the option, the workers are given the option that in that situation to buy out the corporate structure and run it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not beyond reason that the government would support
Mm-hmm.
activities like that.
Sure. Let me argue with you again. I don't know why I'm taking fights with my dear friends. I mean, I like you guys, but here we are. I mean, suppose we did have a thing where all the workers in a factory or an enterprise somehow got the money to buy it out and run it themselves. Can we be confident that then they would stop producing military goods and do something, that's socially beneficial, produce something like solar panels or something? I don't think so, because they'll still be in the situation of wanting to make money, and they want their jobs, and they have all the same interests involved as the capitalists did who owned it beforehand. We see this, for example, here in Canada, where the Canadian government has a contract with the government of Saudi Arabia, couldn't think for a minute, and to provide a tremendous number of armored personnel carriers. And everybody in Canada wants them to break that contract and refuse to sell that equipment to the Saudis, because they're using it in violent ways, and we know what kind of government they are. Well, the government really seems to be unable to break the contract, because all of the workers involved it's a huge contract, and there would be thousands of unemployed people as a result of it. So the unions very frequently, and in this case, presumably the workers who are making these armored personnel carriers, want to have it go on. And I don't see why, if we simply redistributed the ownership of the corporations to the workers, that would necessarily lead to policies that are in the public interest. My own notion of how you might be able to make some changes, there are two angles I could see doing. One would be something I learned from Michael Lerner, who lives in Berkeley. You may even know each other. He's a rabbi there, and he's wrote a book called The Left Hand of God. And his notion was that corporations have something like a charter or permission to function, and it could be made limited to 5 or 10 years, and at the end of 10 years there should be a public inquiry to see whether the policies that the company was pursuing were in the public good or not. And if they were not, then you take the charter away from them and give it to somebody else and let another group of people run the business. I think, well, okay, that sounds pretty good, but I think my solution would be a little different. I would have panels elected by, a panel of environmentalists, a panel of feminists, women's groups, a panel of people who are interested in animal welfare, a panel of people who are interested in solving hunger or pandemics or protecting forests, or, different groups with different interests, consumers and employers, employees, and so on. And each of these panels would elect a number of people to represent their interests, and every corporation over a certain size should have to appoint to their board of directors one or two, or one person, let's say, from each of these different panels, so that on the board of directors there would be direct democracy. That would have the public interest would be upheld by these whistleblowers or these people in power to make decisions for the company. I think either of those would be better than simply hoping that if you turn over the ownership from one group of people to another, that you're necessarily going to get a more benign set of policies.
That's a excellent explanation of making decisions from the bottom up, which of course is one aspect of what we need to do. And building democracy, making decisions, and then being able to control capital in the world to make sure it is being used for human betterment. That's the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And that's been very, very limited in terms of democracy. Doesn't exist. And the transnational class, of course, uses the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, to set policies that continue to allow growth and expansion. And the military and governments do everything they can to protect that capital, and even do regime changes around the world for those governments that aren't supporting capital growth. So that there's a huge problem here, and we've got to do it from the bottom up. Certainly calling for a living wage and a minimum income for all families is one thing that I think is vital. We can certainly start with that and then ask for greater stability in terms of the environment.
So if we were to move toward a system like the one that you described, Metta, the question of who would be on boards, decision-making boards, doesn't depend upon the logic of it. It depends upon the pressure that a group of environmentalists can have to make their case, and to make their case before voters, so that people who are in office and have to make decisions on that feel the pressure from below. If they feel that pressure from environmentalists, if they feel that pressure from women, if they feel that pressure from disadvantaged people, they will accommodate to that pressure. There'll be all kinds of fightbacks from the corporate elite. But again, as Peter says, that even among that group, they do have grandchildren, and they do have a stake in the world. And if it's growth and the present model is going to wipe out that world, they're going to lose also.
Of course, that's the other argument why growth is a bad idea. It is the assumption, and I think it's maybe just an assumption, I don't know whether it's true, the assumption that growth requires the continued exploitation of the world's limited resources. And obviously, because there's only so much gold or titanium or whatever in the world, eventually you're going to run out. And so we have to stop growing so we don't waste the limited resources that we have to depend on. I don't know whether you could say, I wish I could talk to an economist who could explain this to me, because I'm really torn in my own mind. Is it possible that we could just pay each other a little bit more every year? Let's say, because most people are actually doing work that does not, most of my friends, most of the people in the world that I know are not doing manufacturing where they're using up the limited amount of copper in the world or whatever, but are doing thought work. We're producing, we're either psychotherapists or we're writers, or we, give advice to people on how to invest their money or to be happy, or, there are various things that we do professionally that do not involve exploitation of natural resources or the depletion of natural resources. Suppose then we just pay everybody a little bit more for writing poems or, conducting orchestras or something every year. We would have a growth economy, but we wouldn't be expending any more resources than we are now, or maybe even less if we live simply. Is that a reasonable thing to say, or am I being irrational? I really don't understand economics enough to know whether I'm making sense or not. Somebody help me.
Well, I think what you're saying is very valid, that you recognize the problems in the world today, that there has to be a systematic transformation of how capital is used and worked, and that you think that that should be a decision that's made democratically and grassroots based.
Yeah.
And I couldn't agree more.
Will it work? Are there any economists who would say that it would work?
Well, there's a big pressure on the economy now with the accommodations to the COVID virus. There are lots of people who are young people who are getting a view of what's needed of their lives that was different from it would have been a few years back. It's like a mirror screen that's showing that there are people who are doing things other than or finding gratification and satisfaction in doing things that are helping people and saving lives.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking for careers in that. They want funding for that.
Yeah, and the very fact that people are actually applauding the healthcare workers when they come out of their shift in the hospital, terrific. That's the kind of thing that we need to be doing, is recognizing people who are actually doing constructive work. And that's happening. Yeah.
That's extending now to the people the farm workers who pick food,
Mm-hmm.
and are paid enough for them. We need them. And suddenly they're getting a visibility that they didn't have before.
And I've heard that there's of all the changes, social changes that might come out of this COVID thing, it may be that a universal basic income might be one. That, I yesterday got a check in the mail for $1,200. I haven't even been in the United States for a number of years. I'm still a citizen. I'm dual citizen, but I got $1,200 from the U.S. government to help me through this hard times of the pandemic. Well, they're sending money to people. And I suppose the question arises, people say, if they could do it now, why couldn't they have done it all along? Because I was poor last year too, and they could have helped me last year, not only this year. So to me, it raises the question of whether or not it's not actually quite realistic to talk about putting money in the pockets of everybody and then expecting that, in fact, most people will want to do something constructive with their lives if they have that option, which the money will help provide for them.
I think that's a very positive statement to make. If we put this in the context of the 99% versus the 1%,
mm-hmm.
and that's what the Occupy movement gave us, that mantra, that understanding. People in the world understand that. They know where wealth is concentrated and what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
They want it shared. And the pandemic has stimulated that belief that there needs to be 40 million people lost their jobs in the U.S. Through no fault of their own. And so they are being compensated. Unemployment rates are, the cash that people are getting was raised. But still, their elites are worried about unrest that will destabilize their control, the corporate control. So that they may likely be in a position where they can share more capital. And it's not like, this is taxation money. I mean, they just create the money. The Federal Reserve just says, okay, here's $1 trillion, literally. And it goes to banks and it goes to individuals. But that, of course, when you do that, it lowers the value of the dollar in what we have. Expenses are going up, things are more expensive. But that is doable. And I think they understand that. They're very worried. I mean, they're like the plantation owners' family surrounded by thousands of people in bondage and slavery who were always afraid of an uprising. They're basically the same situation, which is why they have a global military, which is why they have so much money invested in private police, is to control the world populations. And
Peter, I half of me goes with you, and the other half of me says no. It's not just that they're hoodwinking people. People are, a lot of people there's not going to be an uprising against them. There never would be an uprising against them in the U.S. The U.S. people will put up with an enormous amount of stupidity. It's not just U.S., it's all over the world. But the point is, my friend Arlie Hochschild, who's another Berkeleyan, wrote this book, Strangers in Their Own Land, where she attempts to answer the question, why do people so frequently act in opposition to their own interests? So she goes to Louisiana, which has to be one of the worst red states in the U.S., where people's, their education level is terrible, their environment level is terrible, their poverty level is terrible. Everything in their society is the worst that you can imagine. And they know what's causing it. They look out in the backyard and they see there's water there that's polluted. And I saw that guy dumping the chemicals in there. I know that water is polluted and it's causing my family to die because my brother died, my sister died, blah, blah, blah. I know who's killing them. It's that poison they're putting out there. But do we want the EPA to come and crack down on them? No. Why not? Well, they're going to vote for Trump. Why? Well, it's jobs. It's the economy. We have to keep the economy going. And there are enough people, Trump may win again. For enough people say we have to keep the economy going, and our own livelihood depends upon the success of these plutocrats that you happen to have been exposing so badly, so royally. So, I mean, that's what bothers me. What do you do about that? She tries to understand how they think, and she wrote a plausible book explaining how they think, but it's still irrational, isn't it? And there are a lot of them, and they actually may win the next election. There's certainly being able to so far keep things from mailed ballots being permitted. Everything that makes sense to that we need right now is being blocked by people who are. Most of those people are not winning. They're not getting anything out of it. Militarism isn't really benefiting them, but they believe in it.
I wanted to just add one part to that much of what Ollie Hochschild found and what others are finding when they talk to people who seem to hold these extreme beliefs is that they don't feel that they've been heard. When they say that they have a right to have their guns, nobody listens to them. Politicians come around to them every 4 years and try to get them to vote, but then nobody hears anything that they have to say in the meantime. I think it's one of the failings of organizing is to characterize those whose activities support a global elite against their own interests, that we tend to write them off as the opponents, and that they are part of the solution. At a local level, they are concerned about the things that you mentioned, that the waste that's being dumped on their streets, and there needs to be some willingness to be heard. And I'm sort of encouraged by some of the people running for congressional and state offices now, who are saying they go to door in these areas, and somebody says, well, I can't support you because I want my gun rights. And she responds, well, what do you mean by that? And she says, And they say what they mean by that. And she says, that's the same position that I have, that some people should not have the right to have guns because they would do damage with them. But otherwise, I agree with you completely. And they had never thought that anybody would hear them.
Okay, now there's something really there that I'm missing, because, you know, Arlie can go out and hang out with these people and respect them and be friends with them. And their resentment, I think, has to do with the fact that they are not, you're right, they're not being listened to, but mostly they're not being listened to respectfully. And they want dignity. They don't want to be looked down upon. They don't want to be regarded as hicks and stupid and, you know, backward people. I understand their resentment, and I understand why their resentment is toward what they call elites. And unfortunately, I'm one of those, and you are too. All three of us are part of the kind of elite that they resent. They don't seem to resent you know, Bill Gates or, you know, the guys that you mention in your book, Peter. They don't seem to resent them. They resent us because we claim to know some things that they don't want to admit anybody knows more than they do. So it's true that I am not properly respectful to the people whose views I think are really backward. And I don't know how to do that. It just seems to me, if I were trying to say, I understand your point of view, etc., I'd be lying. The truth is, I really don't respect them. And I don't know how to overcome that. The only person I can think of who's really good at it, who's this guy, Van Jones? Is that his name? He's on CNN. He's a black guy. He's actually, I think, married to the niece of Jimmy Carter. Do you know that? And he is really good at talking to people that he thinks he disagrees with very strongly, but talking in a way that makes them feel at least they're being treated respectfully. And I think maybe we all ought to take some lessons from him, but he's not giving lessons. Maybe somebody else is going to train us on how to have a respectful dialogue with people we actually have contempt for. But I'm not good at it, frankly. And maybe that's the problem, that a lot of us are not very good at it.
I hear what you're saying. I think it's an important aspect for all of us to be aware of our privileges, but also not to blame the victims, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
who are voting for Trump. They are literally the victims of global capitalism, mm-hmm. and they perceive and they're encouraged to perceive Trump as a rebel, so to speak, that he's challenging the Washington elite and that he's addressing, you know, and he's protecting white people. The nature of racism is very much involved here.
And we talk to somebody who's a racist and sound respectful. See what I mean? I mean, I really don't know how to have an egalitarian dialogue with people whose views I consider so reprehensible. I get mad at people, you know, I get angry.
There's a very good video of a woman who is a progressive activist who has a meeting and a friendship with a member of the Klan. And it evolves gradually, and the Klan member eventually withdraws from the Klan and begins to see that the things that are missing in the lives of he and his fellow Klan members are not caused by Black people. It is a slow process, but I think it's one of the factors in change, that we don't write off the victims, even if we disagree with them.
everything that you guys have been saying about the fact that there's a global power elite that's able to is making all the bad decisions means that we have to stop them, and that there are answers. I think we've all agreed that there are some economic solutions that we could try that would make better sense than what's being done now. Then all we have to do is mobilize enough demand on the part of the public to get that. And I think that is what peace activists are for, is we're supposed to be talking to the people who disagree with us, who don't think the way we do, and converting them. I frankly don't know why. I still don't know, even after knowing Arlie well and having read her book and loving it. I still don't really understand why they are so stubborn as to keep on believing things that are obviously contrary to their own interests. And until I can get a real feel for what that's like, I'm not sure I'll ever be good at talking to people that I think are irrational.
If you look at it in particular issues, like when there is a defense appropriations bill and people want to make sure that the defense jobs that are in their community are going to stay. And that's a time to indicate how much of that defense bill is used to pay lobbyists, two to each member of Congress, to create the need for wars.
Have you ever convinced anybody of anything? I'm not sure I can remember a single time where I've actually, in a discussion with somebody, pointed out something like, look at the money being wasted, and see them flip over to accepting what my argument.
I take students, and Mark has this experience as well, at the beginning of a semester who may be very racist, but then you have them read the book White Rage and they start to understand where that's coming from. And you have conversations about it extensively in class, and they hear other students and they hear themselves, and then I see huge transformations that happen, but it can take, weeks. But I think a big part of all of this is that you don't need to convince half the population. This isn't an election issue. This is about getting activists, and 10% of the people can change the world, literally, if they're engaged in activism, pushing for universal Declaration of Human Rights as the core, and adequate income for every human being. I mean, that could, in fact, change the world. We don't need a majority, 1 out of 10, and that would be amazing. I mean, that's what happened in the revolution for the U.S. Only about 1 out of 10 people actually were engaged. So finding activists and engaging in social movements, and that's why Occupy scared elites so greatly. I mean, they infiltrated every Occupy group in the country, in the world, and were terrified that this would mobilize into something beyond what they could control.
It's not a matter of convincing other people that there's an inordinate amount of wealth at the top. It's a matter of getting those who are already living with that belief will be moved by the argument. So the problem is not to find the hardest case of somebody who disagrees with you and try to convince them personally. The bigger problem is to get into the room those who have a stake and don't do anything about it, don't feel that there's anything they can do about it.
I taught peace studies for, 20 some years, depending on how you count it. They didn't ever become peace activists. And I think it's because at a certain age, they're at a phase in life when they need to be independent. And so they're not looking at joining organizations and movements that are already populated with old people. But if they're going to do anything, they would do it on their own. In fact, during the first Iraq War, there was quite an upsurge, and the students organized themselves. and had meetings and gave speeches and whatnot. So that was a time when there were some activists for 5 minutes, at least as long as that war was beginning, and so I took some heart from the fact that some of my students actually got engaged. But otherwise, I think mostly young people need to do things on their own or be independent. And if they're interested in something like the environment, they're now pretty much in the lead as far as activism goes. I don't see that many young people who are active as peace activists. But if they do, they'll do it pretty much on their own, I think, rather than because I told them to.
They have a sense of where we need to go, and the inequalities and the psychological aspects of all of this that I'll empower them with the knowledge that that the world can change, and that we can make it better, and that there's an opportunity there for all of us to engage in that. And that attitude is very valuable in terms of making changes.
Do you see that happening now in particular? I think because of the pandemic, I have noticed that there's an upsurge of interest in creating more or intensifying the networks that exist already among people working on very social issues. You see that in Berkeley and in Sonoma?
In the Depression, people knew that those that had lost jobs, and it was massive numbers in some cities, 50%, and they mobilized together to prevent evictions and to help each other. I mean, that was spontaneous.
Mm-hmm.
Pandemic gives us a very similar kind of response. People realize that we're kind of all in this together. That's what's being said. And but there's something that's beyond their control. And the 40 million people that lost their jobs, it was beyond their control. It was just shut down. And so there's a realization that they don't have control over these kinds of processes, and a desire to make sure that there's some way of protecting themselves. Mm-hmm. I think that's very important. So there's this whole new avenue of restrictions of people and their choices in the world today, which is one reason that a lot of people are resisting, and there's protests all over, especially from the right, in regards to the pandemic and the restrictions of people's liberties to go out and shop or carry guns around or any of that aspect.
That really worries me. What does it mean? I'm not very often considered a pessimist, but I've been leading the argument this whole hour, arguing that you can't be too optimistic about, especially about public opinion.
Well, when a few of us got together to oppose Vietnam, the early escalation of the war in Vietnam, I remember people asking, you know what you're doing? This is a crazy thing to do. The communists are taking over. They're going to be dominoes falling one after another. We're all going to be involved in that. And it took some time. Eventually, as we spoke, I can't find anybody who would say that the Vietnam War was a blessing. Nor can we find anybody very few are going to say that the Iraq War was a blessing. And
after the fact, we can all see that it wasn't a blessing, but we couldn't stop it.
Well, that's the question. I think we did stop it.
The continuation of the effort to put correct information out there in the right place, in the right way, that's what we're all about. And I hope I can learn to do it better. And I'm very grateful for both of you for the work that you've been doing. Peter, thank you so much for that wonderful book and that research that you've done.
It's having these kinds of conversations are vital. Your role was very important, and I think I've really enjoyed hearing Mark and you together. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
These kind of conversations that are too rare in the political discourse.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank you for doing it. It's been great.
Thank you both. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.